Good day to you. Looks like it's going to be another hot and muggy one out there today as we continue on in this summer that's really still the end of May. And some of you may be driving a car around today, and if you were to go to a convenience store and you had the air conditioning on and you left the car running with the air conditioning on and then went into the convenience store and came back out and the person next to you was sitting in their car, what do you think would happen? Probably nothing, right? It's accepted that in the US, you can go into a store and you can leave your car running because that's your right. You're the one who's paid for the gas, it's your car. And as long as you're not breaking the law, you can do what you want. But I tell you what, if you did that in Sweden, if you came out to your car, the person sitting in their car next to you would be going like this. They would be telling you, no, you cannot leave a car running because it's spewing fumes into the atmosphere and it's continuing a pollution problem that the world has. And so the behavior in Sweden, as far as driving and leaving your car idling and running, is regulated. And that's what today's class is all about. It's discussing dimensions of culture, but from the point of view that all of our behaviors are regulated, no matter what culture you grow up in. And the people around you are the ones who help regulate your behavior. So how do we figure out how our behavior is regulated? Well, there's one of the most famous researchers in this field of intercultural communication. His name is Gert Hofstede. He's a Dutchman, and he studied several company executives from multinational companies across the world. And his work has become the leading theory or theories of intercultural communication and why cultures behave differently from each other, and specifically how people's behaviors are regulated by the cultures that they grow up in. For example, I'm wearing a Penn State shirt. You know that. I'm sure that you do. If you go to a Penn State game, you're expected to wear a Penn State shirt, if you're a Penn State fan, that is. If you don't, you feel out of place. Your behavior is being regulated. This happens all the time in culture. So let's dig into Hofstede's dimensions of culture and see how we can distinguish between different countries around the world and different subcultures according to how behaviors are regulated along the lines of these dimensions. So the first dimension that he talks about is individualism versus collectivism. This dimension speaks to whether the values present in a culture are hoisting up or elevating the individual versus the group as a whole. Now, I can tell you one of the most interesting things that I saw when I took a trip to Ghana, Africa, when I was researching my book, Comparing Media from Around the World, was as I was walking down the street, I saw a car that was literally tilted up on its side, not flipped over, tilted up, with a 2x4 propping it up. Not a jack, a 2x4. And there were 6 people who were looking at the underside of this car. I later came to find out that the car needed to have something done to its muffler, and that because it was a resident of a street in which several neighbors are living together, that all the neighbors were expected to come out and help with the fixing of this muffler. In other words, Ghana, in that particular instance, is a very collectivist culture. It's about the group as a whole. It's not about the individual. Similarly, I can remember that when I taught a communication class here at East Stroudsburg University not too long ago, I asked everybody to introduce themselves, and most of the Americans stood up and said, well, I come from these kinds of conditions in my home. My mom is from this place, my dad is from this place, and I'm a marketing major, or I'm a bio major, and I want to work for this company. And there was a lot of I stuff. And then I had a female in the audience who was from Thailand, and she stood up and said, good afternoon, everyone. I want to wish everybody in the class a great semester. I hope we all learn as much as we can from the professor, and I hope that we leave this class with the knowledge that will help prepare us to enter the world. It was a very different orientation, and it spoke to this dimension, individualism versus collectivism. Now, I'm not going to be able to cover much because of the time length here, but there's a lot of examples in Fred Yant's chapter that discuss how societies can tilt towards individualism, or they can tilt towards collectivism. In the United States, we know that we're a very individualistic country. We see privacy as very important, and we see the ability of the single person to advance their own career and interests as being paramount versus, for example, saying, I need to sacrifice my career right now because my grandmother is getting older and she needs to come live with us. So in countries like China, for example, you find an extended family. You find grandmothers, you find great aunts, you find everybody's living under the same roof. It's all about the family, which is an example of collectivism. Moving on now, we go to the next dimension by Gert Hofstede, in terms of studying values and cultures, and that is the masculinity versus femininity dimension. And this is not quite what you may think it is. What it really refers to is if a country has a masculine dimension to it, the roles between the female and the male are separate and very clear in a masculine culture, whereas in a feminine culture, the roles are more blended. So we can take Sweden, for example, and in another instructor video, I gave you the example that in Sweden, when a couple, a male and a female, have a baby, the father has just as much right to maternity leave as the mother. The father is a caretaker, so the father can leave work and not lose his or her job. Also in Sweden, they actually have a law that they're considering passing that says that 50% of boards that are the operating boards that guide companies, board of officers, board of directors, whatever you want to call it, that 50% of those boards have to be made up of women, to instill this idea that it's an equality, a country of equality. Well, what that's really saying is it's a feminine country. Whereas if you look at a country like Saudi Arabia, for example, at least as it's currently constituted, you will never see a female queen. You have a king. The Fayed family is the royal family in Saudi Arabia, and it's always going to be a male because that is not a role that is appropriate for a female in Saudi Arabia. So it's a very masculine culture. Now moving on to the third dimension of Hofstede, we're discussing the dimension called power distance. Power distance is the extent to which the less powerful groups in a country accept that that's their fate, that they don't have a right to become more powerful. We find this in countries with highly developed class systems. For example, India has, you may have heard, 4 different caste systems. CASTE is how that is spelled. And depending on what caste you grow up in, that's going to determine your occupation. So if you're in the highest caste, the Brahmin caste, for example, then you're going to be able to become a doctor, a physician, etc. Whereas if you're in the lowest caste, the 4th caste, you will become a street sweeper. You will perhaps be a custodian. You will be a person who serves others. And within that structure, if you were born into that 4th caste, you never expect that you can become a doctor. It's not within your realm of dreams. It's not within the realm of possibilities. In other words, you accept that you are going to be less powerful than others. In the United States, we have a very low power distance because in our countries, in the United States, we expect that every person has the right to become rich and powerful and successful through business, through marketing, through entrepreneurship. We expect that every single American has a shot to become president. We even say that. And so power distance refers to the ability of a culture to, not the ability, but the capacity of a culture to accept or to not accept that there is a disparity in wages and a disparity in power. And then that takes us to the 4th dimension by Hofstede, and this is the dimension that's called uncertainty avoidance. In this dimension, we're considering the extent to which people feel threatened by the unknown. You know, I couldn't help thinking the other day as I was sitting in a doctor's office and they happened to have Fox News on, that if you watch a lot of Fox News, you can see the world is a pretty scary place. You have the ticker tape that goes across the bottom and it's always talking about ISIS advancing somewhere in the Middle East, or it's talking about China has taken another island, or it's talking about some area of the world that seems to be unsafe and the United States is not acting strongly enough to avoid what's happening in Iraq or Afghanistan or Russia or Iran. These are danger spots that we see. That's what this dimension of uncertainty avoidance is all about. And when people feel threatened by the unknown, they feel scared. And that causes them to act accordingly. They look at other countries with suspicion. They talk about, quote, evil which is a commonly used word on Fox. They talk about evil on the part of other countries. It's a way of categorizing those countries because people who are hearing the news about those countries may be unfamiliar with them. I mean, as far as I know, nobody in this class has been to Iran, and yet we probably have some fears about Iran developing a nuclear bomb. And that's what this is referring to. It's the uncertainty avoidance dimension. Now, other researchers came along after Hofstede and they extended his work and they came up with three other dimensions, the next of which is the long-term versus the short-term orientation. And so as you grow up in the United States, you think about when you think of what you should be doing with your life, are you thinking in the short term or are you thinking in the long term? Are you thinking what's best for you now and you'll worry about other things later? Is it important for you to have a job this summer? Or is it more important for you to be taking classes? Or is it more important for you to have free time? These are just three things that you can be considering. And each of those might be considered along the lines of is what is best for you right now and what is best for you really in the long term. And this is a dimension that has been added to Hofstede's theory because it does speak to the idea that people that have a longer term frame of thinking, they tend to be thriftier, for example. They don't have any credit card debt, for example. They just do without things. If they have to do without a car, have to do without a cell phone because they don't want to have debt piled upon them, they're looking towards the long term. Now we move on to another dimension of culture that's been added on to Hofstede's theory, and that is indulgence versus self-restraint. This sort of speaks similarly to the previous one, long-term versus short-term orientation, but more specifically, it's referring to the idea of getting gratification for something right away. If you're really, really hungry, you might go down to Wawa and buy something right now. And you may say, I do have some things in the fridge. It's not exactly what I want. So I'm going to go down to Wawa and I'm going to get a sandwich. Or I'm going to go down to Cluck U and I'm going to get some chicken. Or I'm going to go to McDonald's and get a cheeseburger. The whole idea, in fact, of fast food speaks to this. It's about a value of indulgence. It's about getting something right now rather than taking the time to make dinner, taking the time to even grow the vegetables that you use in your foods. That's long-term thinking. And it's also showing more self-restraint. So indulgence versus self-restraint is another value dimension of cultures that regulate behavior. And then we come to the last dimension, which is environmental sustainability. And this is the idea of developing your country for the present, but also taking great care for the future. We drive a lot of cars in the United States. And so we're constantly seeing auto manufacturers and auto dealers in our economic landscape. It doesn't take you much of a drive to pass an auto dealer in the United States because cars are being sold everywhere. And yet we know that the fumes that are produced by cars are ozone depleting. They're depleting that ozone layer, along with factories and natural causes as well. But we do know that the exhaust fumes that come out of a car are not good for the environment. And so environmental sustainability has to do with a culture's placing a value on the environment. And do you know that Brazil is the only country in the United States, the only country in the world, which has only ethanol-only vehicles that are only running from corn, or the byproduct of corn. Our gasoline in the United States has about 10% ethanol in it, but most of it is petroleum-based coming from oil. So Brazil made that strategic decision in part because it had an eye towards environmental sustainability. It doesn't want to keep depleting the world of that finite resource of oil, whereas you can keep growing corn every single year. So environmental sustainability wraps up that dimension. Then we go on to a completely different set of values that are proposed by these very long names. Again, another Dutch name, researchers, the Trompenaar and Hampton-Turner dimensions. Now, some of these overlap with the Hofstede dimensions, but let's mention them nevertheless because they're speaking again to how is our behavior guided by the culture that we grow up in. One of the values is universalism versus particularism. And we discussed that kind of already when we talked about individualism versus collectivism. So I'm not going to spend any time on that. And also, the second dimension also speaks to that as well, individualism versus communitarianism. I'll invite you to check that out in the book. But the one that I do want to speak about is the dimension that's called specific versus diffuse. Specific versus diffuse. And what this speaks to is the encouragement whether to keep work separate from your leisure life. In the United States, we have very little separation. We see people commuting into the city. We see them working from 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock till 5, 6, 7 at night. And then when they come home, they're bringing their work home. And so in our particular culture, we do not have a specific value there. We have a diffuse value where we're expected to be working all the time, really. And that even makes its way into our conversations when we speak to each other. One of the very first lines of questioning, if you're meeting someone, is, what do you do for a living? What are you doing for money, essentially? And that's because our work is so prevalent. We meet our spouses, our partners, our girlfriends, our boyfriends through work. We talk about work. We bring our work home. Europeans have a saying. They say in the United States, you guys live to work, whereas here in Europe, we work to live. And that's why, for example, Germany has a law on the books that you have to have a minimum of 5 weeks vacation per year because of the importance that does for regenerating your mental health. Here in the United States, we get 2 weeks, usually, sometimes only 1 week, until you've worked 15 years for a company, and then maybe you can get it up to 3 weeks. And then the last dimension that I want to mention that is radically different from the Hofstede dimension is the neutral versus emotional dimension. And that's the extent to which you show your emotions within the greater culture in which you live. We know that people from the Germanic countries in Europe, for example, we would say Sweden, Germany, Holland, some parts of Belgium, Denmark, Finland, those people are raised in cultures where emotions are not expected to be displayed, at least outwardly. And so you find people to be more reserved in those cultures. Whereas if you go to Latino cultures and Hispanic-speaking cultures, Mexico or Cuba or Venezuela or the Dominican Republic, you're expected more so to be able to show your emotions in public. If you're happy, you're excited, you're thrilled, you can jump up and down. If you feel just really great, you can dance. You don't see a lot of Germans necessarily feeling like they can just dance, dance in the sunshine. And so that brings us now to our last dimension that we're going to discuss for today of Trompenaar and Hamden Turner, and that is the sequential versus synchronous time dimension. And what this refers to is, in your own culture, are you expected to do one thing at a time before you take on something else, or which would be sequential, or are you often doing many things at one time, synchronous? Now, I happen to believe that social media are really making all countries synchronous because, even the way that something like baseball is watched, which would be kind of the marker for a summertime activity for a lot of people, a slow baseball game on in the past. Baseball is not watched today with that kind of take it easy, kick back, it's summer kind of approach. Today, people will be on their phones, they'll be posting on Facebook, they'll be messaging each other through Facebook, they'll Snapchat each other, they'll tweet each other, they'll look stuff up on the web on their smartphones, and then at the same time, they're going to be eating, with something in their other hand. And so we today share that in common with other nations. I think that we're moving more towards a synchronous kind of approach to life where we're doing many different things at one time. And then the chapter now moves to the final element that it considers, which is a very interesting case study of Japan. It's interesting from so many different respects. It is an Eastern country, so we would expect it to be radically different from the United States. But through various factors, religion, history, and some others that are discussed in depth in the book, Japan is a very individualistic country. It doesn't fit easily in with being an Asian country, being an Eastern country. It's in the middle in a lot of different ways. I invite you to check that out. So that's going to wrap things up for today. I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. We're halfway through the course.